I was going to open up and just remind you, anybody who had not heard this, that these little meetings and commentaries, if you take what is being said as simply being some notation, observation having to do with human behavior, although it will fit and although it might seem applicable, if that's all you do, shall we say that you're missing something? All right, you're missing something. This is not psychology, although I understand it fits. It is not sociology, although it would dovetail right into some people's observations and might even seem to be a pushing forward of the vast frontiers of the soft sciences. But it is not those things. That is not the intent of it, because this is actually five-dimensional physics. But if all you hear, if you just take it as simply being comments having to do with human behavior, although it fits, and I use examples and mention not only individual human behavior, but hand gestures. I mean human institutions, large collections of peoples. And although it will fit, if that's all you hear, it would be like going to a movie, a three-dimensional movie shot in stereo, and you watch it with one eye and one ear. All right, if you don't like that. It would be comparable, instead of you taking this to be a real manifold attempt to describe physics as beyond the three-dimensional world, it would be like you listening to and dreaming about that this is only having to do with human behavior and taking, let us say, past instances wherein you burnt your fingers fooling around with matches, and you believe that that is some comprehensive commentary or experience having to do with the nature of combustion. Or that perhaps your brother-in-law is a pyromaniac. And you think, yes, well, now I understand exactly what it means to be inflamed, if not flammable. It's something else. Except there's just no way to intelligently, I like that, intelligently discuss five-dimensional physics as if there's an alternative to intelligently. But recall, since a few of you seem to like it this time, the intent would be like a three-dimensional movie in Dolby stereo, and you're simply using part of the facility. It will still look all right, more or less. It'll still sound all right. But that is not the intent of it. The origins of this kind of information has more depth, has a different landscape, has a different background than simply entertaining or even apparently informative commentaries on human behavior. Because human behavior, I hate to tell you, human behavior is a dime a dozen. I hate to use cliches, but when it fits. I was going to try and pick us up and continue what we were talking about last time, having to do with the fact that by way of talk, in what we have been pleased to call the secondary world of man, by way of talk, men attempt to mark off non-spatial, non-animal territories in one another's psyche, using psyche in the full sense of that being opposed to simply the physical, somatic areas of man. Into each other man's brain, into his talking nervous system, you're attempting, by way of talk, to mark off a territory, to make an impression, to make a lasting indentation in the other person's intellect. It is a kind of secondary marking, we could say, as opposed to a primary, crude, animalistic marking of our good hairy and furry friends lifting up a hind leg and letting fly to mark off a corner or a bush where their spatial external territory is. There is a direct parallel, symbolic into the fifth degree at least, of this going on. And with very few exceptions, which amounts to just a passing interchange of energy, the rest of human verbal intercourse is in some way tied to you attempting to do it to other people attempting to do it to you for reasons that no one comprehends. Because to explain it at the three-dimensional level as this being part of human behavior and being motivated by individual personalities and quirks and etc., that's all the ordinary intellect wants. To say, well, that's why people talk to each other, that's why people argue, that's why people try and flex their ego. That's all you're saying. It has to do with energy transfer. So back to where we were. Make those the pickup notes. All right, less than what still goes on circa 1990 right now of a few increasingly impertinent actual external skirmishes that seem to be groups of people, nations, or groups fighting over actual spatial territory. The old assumed basis of warfare and aggression. Other than that, which is becoming increasingly, almost as we speak. Yes, I hear it now. I hear it decreasing. I hear it growingly decreasing. Other than those kinds of fights, which are almost non-existent right now, other than that, I was going to ask you to consider why it is that humanity throughout history, and still going on now, so roundly denounces warfare. I remind you again, you could come up with all sorts of old-time stories from your nervous system that life would still be talking about. It might give you some kind of spiritual attempted spin on this, or it might try and give you some psychological view of it and say, well, it does not do good for men to be unbridledly aggressive, that it can become unprofitable, that we're all locked up here on this little orb whirling through space and we've got to learn to live together, and etc. Heads up. I'm going to tell you an unknown, and it's certainly beyond any three-dimensional reason why men so roundly condemn fatal aggression. That is, that's when they're talking about warfare. It's not just destruction of property. The murder of your fellow man, even if it be under the name of nationalism. Why is it so ingrained? Why is it poets and historians, philosophers so rail out against murder? And not just individual, I'm talking about institutionalized murder. The warfare of peoples. And the very ones who even do it, the poets and the philosophers, will still, once the populace begins to march off, they got their new little uniforms on, they got their helmet shined, and they look around, they see a whole bunch of women having shivers over these guys in uniforms, and the poet that had just been writing anti-war poetry will suddenly look around to see where he can join up or find a discarded helmet and join in. And yet they still, the nervous system of man that talks, still condemns institutionalized murder, warfare. Why? Are you ready? No drum roll. It is because of this, that once the other parties, the opponents, that once the other parties are dispatched, it is impossible, or moot, look at it either way you want to, it has become moot to impossible to mark off any territory now in their psyche. Any of you that need a slight hint so that you won't think perhaps or imagine that you're thinking the worst, it is not uncommon in a few nervous systems here, but the information life has never let spread out in anything that approaches an objective manner, so that is, it's not talked about a lot. But there are people around, reasonable people, that are not that upset when they hear about mass slaughters of people. But the influence of the city, the influence of the city direction of secondary world is such that most civilized people will, if the discussion comes around about, or a petition that we must, everybody sign up, we're against war. Any reasonable person will sign up. But it is not absolutely on the pale of civilized occurrences in the higher end of nervous systems of people, not to be all that upset. You know, as long as the war is not getting in your backyard. If people over there, you know, if the polyester people won't fight the wool people over, you know, what the hell they're fighting about, and they kill each other, you know, Jesus, if they're that crude, I'm not going around and talk about it, but, you know, let them have at it. Just keep them away from me. And even that makes no sense, because if that kind of person that handles that kind of energy as, in a sense, still as mutant as that is, they should still be curious as to why it is that there is, even in me, I'm speaking for that person, me a kind of feeling of regret or remorse or guilt that I shouldn't be feeling this way, because we should all be soundly condemning institutionalized murder, warfare. But no one can come up in the city level with any kind of a clinical attempt as to why, still assuming that you are not in the fracas, that there's no danger that you're about to get killed at somewhere else. Like, who cares? Well, what difference does it make? They're not going to wipe out the whole world. So why is it? And as I said, even those that life has made to denounce it publicly and historically, they will still join in the fray and fight. So, but why is it that even whilst cutting up each other, shooting one another, that people will turn around and talk about, boy, we shouldn't be doing this. This is horrible. War is hell. They're wiping blood off while they're saying that. What's going on? It is the aggressive attempt to mark out territory, and of course at one time the aggressive attempt seemed to be down at the primary level of fighting actually over arable territory or places where crops would grow or where they could find food, fighting over territory itself, somewhere that they actually could live and prosper. But now it has gradually gone to the point that you surely understand that people are no longer actually fighting or even posed to fight to any large degrees over primary matters, over territory itself. What they're attempting to mark off up till the last few months ago, we could say that, for instance, between that classic for the last 20 years apparent standoff and threatened conflict between the Eastern Bloc countries, communism and capitalism, the West, they kept attempting, they call it wars of propaganda, just to make it simple, but they were attempting to apparently capture, as they might say, the minds of their opponents. Even those that they may have subjected to a kind of physical aggression at one time, they still, through propaganda, which is an attempt to mark off territory, kind of an institutionalized approach to it, trying to make a permanent mark on somebody else's or large groups of people's intelligence. But notice it seemed to be a fight, though it was not overt for the last 20 or 30 years, 40 years, but it was an attempt in this kind of verbal aggression to make a lasting impression on one's psyche instead of one's body. And it was still a kind of warfare. It was seen as a kind of warfare. But it was not potentially, just in the verbal stage, fatal. But was it not taken seriously? It was taken indeed seriously. And even while there were rumors of wars, threats of wars, verbal sable rattling between these two large groups, you still had on both sides many areas of people's talking nervous system saying, this has got to stop. We cannot kill one another. But it makes no sense. Now, at the ordinary level, people say it makes sense. Well, God's told us not to fight. My religion told me not to fight. My conscience told me not to fight. But it still makes no real sense. Animals fight. Animals kill each other. What's the big deal? There's some group over there is so dumb that they want to fight over, is God a redhead or is he blind? If they want to fight, what the hell? Just give them away from me. I don't care. Too many people around anyway. Clear out the expressways. Why is it that there is built into all nervous systems, though, this absolute conviction among secondary, that is civilized, intellectual, driven people, that something is drastically wrong with warfare, murder? It is because that once you have murdered a man, forget that old joke. They used to say, whatever philosopher it came from, that just because you have conquered a man, tortured him, just because you have defeated him, does not mean that you have persuaded him to your point of view. And then there was a crude Alabama type joke on top of that, that just because you have killed a man doesn't mean you've convinced him that you're right, but at least you've killed him. But there's a point past that. That's not just funny. There's a point past that if you have killed a man, you can no longer mark him off. Whatever it was that was germinating, whatever the kind of energy that life is driving through you about some point, whether it been political, religious, or just a kind of personal self-advertisement, you can no longer make any particular mark on that person. You cannot mark off a territory in his intelligence. You can kill him, You can say, well, I've got to get his attention, and you can kill him, and you can stand there and say, now listen, I'm going to tell you the last time my way is right. It's all over. It is, in regard to the secondary marking, what you end up with is a drastically incorrect result vis-a-vis what the original energy-based concept was. That is the intention. Now you got to separate it now, because that's no longer much of most people's problems. You've got to separate it from what would be a primary-based physical act of aggression, or series of acts, or processes of acts of aggression. That's not what you're confronted with day by day. What you're confronted with is a secondary form of aggression and warfare. The business world, the social world, dealing with your family. That it's verbal rather than you being always having to pose to physically fight or run for it. It is now up here. But it's not seen as to what the intent is. And people, as life has it arranged, believe that they are under undue stress and that life is very ambiguous, unrewarding, that people are slightly askewed, to say the charitable least. But what you're dealing with is if this aggression, now we're talking about the secondary, not the actual hand-to-hand combat, but the kind of aggression of one person toward another in the business world, financial world, social world. If we're talking about talk, they still believe, they still say that this aggression has got to stay within limits. And the limit that we've got to fear is that this could result in someone's death. But it's not because there's a big old man somewhere up in painted on black velvet that's saying, naughty, naughty, don't kill each other. That's not the point. The point is, if you have killed your other potential dance partner, ordinary people would say your opponent, whether it be an individual or, if it was back to warfare, a collection of people, what appears to be your opponent, your dance partner here for a bit. If you kill the other person, there is no way that you can any longer impress them. You cannot impregnate the seed of their mind with the sperm of what you are going to say. So certainly once you begin to see it that way, life has a vested interest on a large scale of still condemning through men homicides of an individual and especially of a collective nature. You might also consider why it is so common in the city that man condemns suicide, because from another view, not to be sarcastic at all, but from another view, as long as it doesn't affect you personally, it's not in your family, you could say that it's sort of a scaramouchish act, a ridiculous act, to even enact laws against suicide. And yet it's condemned because you can say, who cares if somebody's going to kill herself? They're either nuts or something's wrong, that's not my problem. And it's really ridiculous for us to collectively have anything to say against suicide. So who cares? Whatever drove somebody to do it, let them go at it. But there's another way to look at that suicide is condemned. One stranger to another, that a civilized person will say, we've got to do something. I'm very concerned. There are growing rates of suicide among teenagers. And actual people, too. And a civilized man or woman here kind of attempted cold-blooded, truly, if you were extraterrestrial looking at this from a real scientific view, you could say, well, why? Why are you concerned about these strangers killing themselves? From this kind of vista I was trying to open up for you, you could look at it as being this, that shows that individual failed in their attempt to mark off any new territory in their own intellect. And it is a kind of ultimate warfare with oneself. They failed. And suicide strikes many, many, many people. Strikes people, and they've got no reason why. If you ask them, they would certainly come up with something. I guess they'd quote whoever it was, Walt Whitman or somebody else, that every person that dies, or Coleridge, whoever it was, that every time someone dies, a piece of me dies, which sounds fine. Sounds philosophical, and you could say, well, I just feel that way. I believe that people should have better lives to such a degree that they would not even contemplate suicide. All of that is like looking at your brother-in-law, the pyromaniac, and think you understand what commentaries are going on regarding combustion and energy. Behind that is something else. There is a non-specified, a unnoticed awareness, and you're not to blame for it, and you did not produce it, but it's in life's own nervous system, into man, an awareness that when people commit suicide, just generally speaking, what they have failed to do was adequately mark out in their own psyche new territory. And it's as though they old aged to death. It's as though they, whatever age they were chronologically, as though they had a kind of psychic arthritis to such a degree that they could not raise up their leg and pee on some new area in their own head and mark it off. That is the ultimate frustration. Not in not having enough money or not having enough adequate lovers. It is the frustration of not being able to mark off a new territory within oneself. It is not analyzed that way, I'm aware, and there's no such diagnosis in the annals of clinical psychology or psychiatry, but it is a form of morbific, fatal ennui, but not in the ordinary sense that you're bored with life. The people are bored, which is a form of absolute disappointment of their inability to mark off some new area in their brain. And when somebody, just a reasonable, ordinary person as far as all of the environment can tell, that this ordinary person just ups and kills themselves, there's a kind of collective fright that goes through man on the basis that somebody else failed in their attempt to mark off territory in their own mind, fresh territory. Something else that we were mentioning last time. As a group of people become more second worldly, become more civilized, more intellectually centered, and the more that they vis-a-vis one another are driven to penetrate one another's mind, and the more that the drive to do this, the more this begins to resemble the kind of strength that is sexual, to drive one person to try and invade another one in an area somewhat below the head level. The more this happens, you're dealing with something else that I can draw a symbolic and absolute workable parallel to, but it's more than a metaphor for sex and the outcome oftentimes of sex. But what you have of the diversity of men in the secondary world, not just physically, we're talking about the secondary world, the world of talking intellectual man, the diversity of opinion, conflicting beliefs, ideas. And this resulting, as we were mentioning last time, in a earth-wide, comprehensive cross-pollination. That's about as far as we took it last time. But beyond all that, in this kind of cross-pollination, in this continuing, ever-expanding, non-ending talk, debate, argument, proselytization, the result is, when it is meaningfully enacted as a marking off, two people arguing, two large groups of people debating, that one, well, this is two people. When one person has meaningfully marked off a territory in the nervous system of the other person, then what results, which should be obvious once I say it, you have a kind of neural pregnancy. It's like a variation of something that many of you seem to have enjoyed over the last some months, a variation that I could say that the world's big enough for everybody's brain to get pregnant. And the thing about the secondary pregnancy, this neural pollination, you don't have to worry about how ugly your brain is. I mean, not like the rest of some of you have to worry about shall we say, the crude outer clothing of the physical man. And I know internally everyone is beautiful, except, of course, Ray Stevens. But the world is big enough, no matter how, quote, ugly, unappetizing, unattractive you might think your brain to be, trust me, you may not be able to get a date on Saturday night with $100 bills strung around your neck instead of a gold chain. Or, as they say, if you're the warden of a woman's prison with 14 rows of vibrators or some shit stuff. That may be true, but I can tell you this, the world is plenty big enough, no matter what your perception of your brain is, the world is big enough that everybody's brain can get pregnant. About all you got to do is go out the door. Because all you got to do is just probably walk out the door and look around, and somebody's probably there, a stranger, going to be looking around, and some stranger going to try and say, "What you looking at?" Now, maybe that's not what you would consider to be a first-class neurosexual act, and it may not result in anything that you would conceive to be a healthy delivery later. But my intention was that you come out of the house and you look around and somebody, you're just looking up and down the street and somebody standing there and says, "What you looking at?" And you think, the person made a meaningful marking. You know, if you go on, a pollinization has taken place. It had a very good shot at a kind of pregnancy, but then, of course, you've got to get into the relative degree of what seems to be of lasting consequence. And every time that someone speaks to you, every time that somebody's words make some lasting impression on you, does not, of course, mean that you're going to deliver. So, of course, the parallel, the metaphor will finally begin to crumble a bit. But if you can get good enough to see it as symbolic instead of metaphorical, symbolism never crumbles. Symbolism is your friend. Metaphors will lend you money. But symbolism will not only dance with you, when it's all over and the band's packing up, you can say, and symbolism will go right along. The combination, let us say we're back to two people engaged in the kind of ordinary, secondary affairs, the intercourse of civilized social man. The combination of the and the other person, the egg, the present status of the other person's mind, which is having to freeze arbitrarily and artificially a more complex five-dimensional scheme of reality and bring it down to a three-dimensional level that we're talking about two people. One person, we're talking right then, just artificially, we're cutting up the process of that person's life. We're cutting up the process of human life and making that person a thing specific. It's the only way we can talk about it, the only way we can make an example. So we're talking about the person's present state of mind, right then. That's like the egg. And then let's say that the other person, you, talking to this person, and the combination between their present state of mind, the present condition of their psyche, of their intellect, mixed with, you could say, the verbal sperm of your words, results, whether it seems to be meaningful at the time or not, but results in a new birth. It is a kind of child of an idea. And it's never your idea. Let us say that you are the spermie and they're the spermer. Let's say they're the egg. You're talking and they're listening. That's the dance going on. You're talking and the subject comes up about politics, sex, shoe sizes, anything interesting. And so you start talking and say, "Well, wait a minute. Now that you mention it," and you go, "Da-da-da-da-da-da-da," and the person going, "Oh, yeah." And they're, dancing backwards. You're dancing forward. You're attempting to, do them. You've got your leg up and you're trying to mark them off. They go, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." Because when they get through, then the bush pisses on the dog. And so they know that. And so they wait, but they're listening. Yeah, 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 yeah. Consider whatever it is that you're saying. Let us say that you're discussing, the subject came up. You're sitting at the bar and somebody over there, you and this guy over here, somebody or it's on TV discussing the great political conflicts between the X party and the Y party. Now let's say the 2 party and the 4 party. And you both listen for a while, and there's a raging debate, and then it goes to a commercial. And so you and this guy fall in conversation for a few minutes. And it turns out you both show some interest in politics. And so you say, well, da-da-da-da-da, and you start and you give a pitch. You raise your leg and you attempt to mark off in him your support for the 2 party. And he listens. So you get through and you reach for your drink, and now it's his turn to raise his leg, and he attempts. And so he comes back and he says, well, if I may humbly submit to you, you seem like an intelligent man. Contraire, I have a certain kind of fondness, if not philosophical, agreement with the 4 party. And so he starts that with you. Do you understand? And assuming that you're listening to him, and he's making some impression. You do understand this, do you not? Surely you do. Lie to me. The pregnancy, that is the marking off that you make to whatever degree in him, in the degree that he makes in you. The mark left in you that he did is not going to be, and any mark you leave on him will not be. No. Now I can make it simple and just for instance and say it's going to be R. But the point is, it will not be either your opinion in him or his opinion in you. If that was possible, if that was the way life is supposed to be, regardless of what some of your brains think, then shortly after, take it metaphorically, after the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, sit down and chatted for a bit, there would have been nothing to talk about since then, because whatever opinion the one dancer had, he would have told her, and then she'd listen and say, well, if I may correct you, or let me give you my opinion. So she would have straightened out his opinion, and they'd both went, huh. And they would have thought, how nice. What a boon it was to have met you, because now it's all straightened out. And she went, me too. And so we would have had what? According to that guy that tracked down the Bible where it was, 4,722 years and 6 minutes, we'd have had of silence. None of us would be talking, because starting out with the dichotomous necessary germination, even at the animal level, of the 2 sexes in the 3D world, and now into the non-sexual fertilization that I'm talking about, the kind of neural intercourse going on, not sexually, but now intellectually. It'd be like Adam and Eve once screwed and went, well, that's that. And then they would have had one conversation. He would have given all his opinions, all that he had, and she'd given all he had, and they would both go, well. And so what she didn't understand, he would have cleared up for her. And then what he was confused about, she would have reported back, and they both went, huh. So they'd have had, I guess, a cigarette after doing it, physically, and then they had one after talking, and that'd been it. Do you understand? Because no matter how seriously people attempt to discuss something and relay their opinion back and forth to each other, your opinion does not go, let's assume that your opinion on anything is worth 2. Doesn't mean anything, but your opinion, if somebody, your best friend, if you were a teacher, if somebody's paying you to tutor them in something, and they go, yes, I want to know exactly what you mean, if they do their best, if they try and get a monkey grip on their own brain, they go, yes, and they will listen. They make you repeat. They make you say it backwards. They make you say it slower, and they listen. They write it down. They get an engraving tool, and they try to do it. No matter how they try, they will not come up with 2. It's not possible. If they did, no one would get pregnant. If they did, there would be no expansion of the secondary world of man. That is, the intellectual world. What ordinary people, I guess we call information and knowledge, would have stopped. There would be nowhere to go. And yet, notice, it is wired up into man that humanity finds this to be a stumbling block. It's bad enough that some people have been and may still be so crude as to fight over water rights or just fight over old crude stuff. But now we've got people, we're down to the point that even civilized men may not physically feel that aggressive one toward another, but by God, they will get upset and even consider physical mayhem over ideas, over opinions. And we've got to do better than that, my friends. We've got to straighten that out. There's nothing to straighten out. If they could straighten out, it would be mass suicide. or if there was somebody, some man or woman who could straighten this out, it would be mass murder. They would have killed everybody except themselves. And of course then they'd have to commit suicide, which ain't my problem as long as they do it out of town. How about a new fix? Since most of you come from a biblical background, at least your progenitor's nervous system, how about the old idea, more or less from, I think, Genesis, of the gods sending Adam, sending the first man, sending him out and telling, or Abraham, whoever the hell it was, sending him out and saying, go forth and spread your seed, which sounds fine. It's like, only one or two people on the earth, and so they had to get out and spread their seed. Think how many times they had to. What they do for cigarettes? Actually, they had to do it like 24 hours a day to get things going. But at any rate, do you see that there is another, beyond the animal, beyond the sexual level, something of much more importance once you get past physical creation, sexual creation, of the gods doing Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, or people doing it, creating their own little clones physically, little nippers. Beyond that, consider that the gods told the first man, go out and spread your seed, but it was go out and spread the intellectual seed. Because physically, nobody has to tell you to do it. Nobody, you could say that the man's ideas of gods, you're pushing it to say that the gods, once they created everything, animals, rats, minks, rabbits, and man, that man, that at least Western gods' crowning glory was so dumb that rabbits and everybody else run off, and the first thing we wanted to do was, hey, drop your knickers. Rabbits telling each other, and the gods had to tell man, his crowning glory, you people be sure and go out and, find yourself a back seat or drive-in movie and be sure and do it to keep things going. Won't you consider that there was something else involved even in these mythical stories? Not the gods saying, go forth and spread your seed, or go forth and be plentiful sexually. Something would be very amiss. I suggest to you that a different take on that is what it was saying was that man had to go forth and in a sense take on part of the job of creation. He had to go forth and spread the seed, but not sexually, the intellectual seed. That is, he had to go out and find strangers somewhere and say, hey, what do you think of the Mets this year? And if the guy says, I love the Mets, and go, oh, what do you think of the congressional races in your district? Republican? Going Republican? And the person say, I hope not. Then you think, I'll stop here and chat a while. Because instead of I will stop here and perhaps engage in sex for a while, that I find the women attractive here, it is I will stop here and spread my seed, and of course be spread. People don't think about it that way, but if whoever dancing forward is going to dance backwards in a few minutes. The bush gets it turned, and all dogs finally get wet. But that is, I suggest to you, the kinds of stories that you find not only in the Bible, but all these religions and myths of the gods in some way encouraging their creation, man, to go forth and be plentiful, bountiful. But surely, you just never thought about it. The gods didn't have to say, hey, go forth and screw all you can. Or go forth and be bountiful even beyond that. Go forth and plant a lot of food so you have something to eat. And all the people went, wow, boy, am I glad he told me that. Come on. It was something else. There is another aspect also you might note, as long as we're here, just a slight expansion. All over the planet, all over history. I've seen history, in fact, but it's everywhere, is the ideas that seem to be religiously based that say to man that he needs to, or he is capable of, a rebirth, being reborn. Now, that's everywhere. Some aspects of Christianity seem to take it more literally, but the stories are everywhere, and all civilized secondary people, whether they claim to be religious or not, will give some philosophical lip service that there is something in man, some nascent seed that needs to be transformed into a rebirth. Even if you're not religious, you should develop your humane feelings, your charitable instincts. You should try and weed out any kind of prejudice that you have, that you obviously picked up from your parents or from a virus somewhere. You stepped in it. But we have got to fight all that and in some way be reborn. Beyond the very crude level, beyond the ideas that really older nervous system religious beliefs would have that you should actually be in some way metaphorically reborn here, or those that want to push it into a horizontal line of time somewhere up here that you will be reborn after you die. Beyond all of that, the kind of energy behind that, now would you consider that that is actually in reference to man's duty, his intellectual duty, for him to be reborn in a sense through his own, to help produce a secondary world through in a sense of him being reborn and marking off new territories of his own. That the idea of being reborn is not put into man on the individual level, that this is something that should happen to you in some kind of spiritual, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu sense. That what it is referring to is the kinds of energy that is always pressing in the human nervous system, in all men. But the more that you are intellectually centered, the more that you are part of the secondary civilized world, the more you are in charge of helping to pollinate, to spread neural pregnancies, to exchange ideas, to try and throw out information, and try and consider as best you can opposing information. And if you don't look at it as being receptive at all to new information, at least you listen to other people's incorrect information. I mean, you got to give it a good hearing so that you can say, well, I'm glad I listened to you because now I can help. Because now I see the basis of your folly. Or if they don't want to listen, you can walk off and at least think, well, it's good to read a liberal magazine if you're a conservative, because then at least I know what those wise sons of bitches are up to, those smart asses. Or if you're conservative, etc. But there is a form of energy going on behind these erstwhile or otherwise religious notions of being reborn that has to do with man's intellectual duty, taken from a verbal, three-dimensional view. Surely you can see the palm of your own hand, that you can see that if things were no more than they appear, then we would have no civilized world were it not for man. The birds wouldn't do it, the bees wouldn't do it. It is man, and man has got to be intellectual. He has got to be developed to the point that he has a talking nervous system. Then, as ordinary intellect would want to call it, then he creates this partially unnatural world. As environmentalists and social critics, that all this unnatural world. That is the secondary world. But notice, if everything else were equal, this world out here, the civilized world, would not have happened in a Darwinistic fashion naturally. That men had to purposely do it. They had to have the intellect operating to invent this otherwise unnatural world. So in a sense, men are a part of creation. It is a secondary creation, and they are not going around creating matter. They are not creating from scratch species. They are creating what? They are creating new territory. Where? Not on the planet. I knew I'd say that. Well, I was hoping I would. As long as I'm here, how about a quick advanced look at five-dimensional physics? It has been noted in classical physics and even here amongst us. Let's start with the three-dimensional level right quick so we can get symbolic. That it has been noted that there is no such thing as a complete transfer of energy or transformation of energy from one form to another. That something is always lost. And it has not been too far back that we were discussing, and I made note of the fact that when these kinds of secondary energy transfers between people happen, it is never complete, which is what I'm talking about right now, a few minutes ago, that if they were complete, then if someone tried to give you a serious lesson about a philosophical discussion and you were supporting the two philosophy, and you could in some way fully transfer the two, and they go, I got it, then that would be a full transfer. But even if they say, I'm going to try my best, You have been correct about everything else you told me. I'm going to try my best to believe what you say. Tell me. Give it to me. And you give them the best shot. You raise your leg the highest. You still your verbal kidneys up. And you let it fly. And they say, I've got it. I've got it. And the best they can do will never be 2. It'll always be 1.9. Something. Because something gets lost. It's not possible in the three-dimensional world for there to be a full, complete transfer or transformation, but a transfer, let's say, between 2 sources or 2 points right now, 2 people, of energy. That something's always lost. All right, we always say that. But come on, heads up again. Lost? Where'd it go? You can't get lost in a closet. But the full energy transfer does not happen. But to say it's lost, which in physics does them fine, they just say, well, it's lost. That's part of the laws. That's part of the laws of classic physics, that there is no such thing as a complete. They know it. It's an accepted fact. There's no such thing as a complete transformation of energy. It cannot be done. You lose something. They say lose. They can say, well, it goes away in friction, for instance, heat. And they just say it's lost, and that's the end of it. They just know it's true, and there's nothing can be done about it. But now talking about secondary, the world is of some consequence, if you're interested in such stuff as this. In the intellectual world of man, it still appears to be absolutely true that there's no such thing as a complete transfer. There's no way that you can tell somebody, not on any kind of meaningful level, that is on some kind of level that would have some impact on their life. There's no way that you can tell one person this one bit of energy you have, information/energy, and they try their best. You say, I'm going to hand it to you, I'm going to tell it to you. You say, I'm going to be all tongue and lips, and they're going to say, I'm all ears. And no matter what you do, part of it won't get there. Even if you get in the ear and whisper, part of it won't get there, it gets lost. Where? Lost how? What? Unnoticed. That it is not complete, it's never complete. But instead of lost, now I'm going to tell you. It unnoticed drifts off into what would be otherwise apparently unrelated territories. Dot, 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 or dash, 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 or semicolon, semicolon, semicolon. In regard to whatever situation we're talking about these 2 people, these 2 sources of energy, these 2 junctures, these 2 points in the in life's body, these 2 humans, the energy that is lost verbally, psychically, going from one person to another, goes off unnoticed into unrelated, apparently, areas. And what it is doing is vis-a-vis this situation, this dance, this confrontation, this marking between these 2 people, that which seems to be lost goes into the situation's e-pool in regards to that situation. It is a continuing, never-ending, ever-expanding fueling of the secondary world. Because if energy between people, we're talking about now non-material, we're talking about the above the primary, outside the primary world of sex and food and physical confrontation and wrestling. If indeed one person could tell another one something, convey energy/information, and nothing got lost, that what they said directly went, that you picked up 2 grams of information and you hand it to another person, and when they got it, it was 2 grams. If that had happened, there would be no passing of information since Adam and Eve. Everything would have stopped. It is what is feeding everything else. And of course, it is all self-fueling in a sense. But what is feeding that outside the situation is that no matter how much you try to, strongly you try and pass this 2 grams of energy / information to another person, some of it gets lost. It is like a form of neural radiation or friction or heat. It goes off, and if right then, if somebody jumped in, if I jumped in and said, all right, whatever you tried to tell that person, can you see, could I make you in some way be able to read the energy dynamics of their brain and realize that what you just tried to tell them, if we gauged it being 2 grams of energy / information, do you see that they were trying their best to listen, but that they only got 1.9? You say, yes, I see that. And I say, so the rest of it went somewhere. And you went, yeah, okay. Do you know where it went? And you go, no. It went everywhere but between you and that person. It is what is feeding everything else. Because if information could be so confined, if energy could be so confined, that now on the secondary level, that is via talk, that you could say something. You could say 2 grams worth to somebody, and they always heard 2 grams worth. And they turn around and told somebody else. They took your 2 grams and they added 1. They turned the person next to them later. They handed them 3 grams, and that other person took 3 grams. You would have a kind of, we'd be speaking after the fact, but it would have been a energetic, it would have been a combustible cul-de-sac long ago, before Adam ever got outside the garden. It had all been over. And so the very things that seems to be a lack of complete understanding amongst people, that civilized people are still driven to say, what's wrong with people? I try to tell somebody something simple, my own son, my daughter, my students. I try to tell somebody something, a carpenter. I tell them to do it exactly like this, and they go, yeah, I got you. And I'll come back later, and they didn't hear it. What's going on? Surely wars have started over just a misunderstanding. We have got to do something about this besides beat on our palms. If something could be done about this, you would have stopped feeding everything that apparently was irrelevant to any particular situation in which you were involved. And if that had happened, there would only been 1 or 2 situations in which you were involved, and that had been it. There would be no feeding of the apparently unrelated territories. You would have never discovered your own Ural, Alaska, Siberia, Patagonia. You would have never gone to the New World. You would have been satisfied where you were. And I'm saying you now, of course, generically, because everyone, the life, blood of life in man, which is information in his singular aspect, would have long been spent. The very things that seem to be conflict, disagreements, etc., which is a form of each person, individually and then collectively, attempting to mark off new territories in other people's minds, in their psyche. Life makes people claim, just decry the fact that this is so and we should do something about it. There's nothing to be done about it. It is health. It is growth. I can put it to you this way. You can forget all these stories about, speaking of course now, mythically and at least metaphorically, but all these stories about the atoms of the world. Forget all these stories about Adam and his mythical failure. Because so long as man is yammering, then he is an exemplary garden tender. Once you see it, that's all you got to ask. If you fell into a deep kind of revolutionary Rip Van Winkle imitation, and you dozed and you didn't know what happened, you woke up there and you're still laying by the campfire around some group of people that seem to be perhaps revolutionists. Or let's say you woke up and nobody's around at first and you're not sure. Has the revolution died? Has it gone away? Is it all over? Has the God's cosmic forces finally done us all in? Am I the last person? Just move down the hill, get close to the city, and if you can hear yammering, trust me, all is well. That's all you've got to listen. Is it still going on? Yakety yak. Is Lieber and Stoller still in charge? Are they still riding them like they used to? That's all you've got to know. It would be only, by the way, as a real postscript, here we go out, it would be only a real revolutionist who might be able to profit from shutting up.